Good morning, everyone. Sorry, it's afternoon now, isn't it? Welcome to our very first CMM Insight Webinar in association with the National Care Forum. Thank you for all joining us today. We've got a really good level of delegate today, so thank you all so much for taking the time. We're really hopeful today's going to be a really useful and informative session, so all of our three speakers will be joining us shortly to get that underway. We will be encouraging you to ask questions throughout the session. The session will be split into three key areas, so Liz will let you know when we're asking questions from you throughout that. If you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, we'll then collate all those questions and we'll ask them directly to the panel for you. Obviously, if you wish to remain anonymous, please just let us know that when you submit your question. Anything that we don't get to today, we can answer for you afterwards, so we'll email your answers directly to you. As you're probably aware, the webinar will be CPD accredited, so we'll be in touch in due course to issue your points to you. Before I hand over to our speakers for the day, we're just going to have a few words from our kind sponsor, who are Planday. So we are just going to have Adrian join us on screen, and we're just going to check everything is working technically for him, and then I'll pass over to Adrian. So Adrian, if you can just pop your camera on for us.
Hi.
Hi, Adrian. Nice to see you.
You too. Thank you, Lisa. I really appreciate it. Hi, guys. First of all, thank you for everybody attending today to take the time out of your busy schedules. I'm Adrian. I head up the health and social care team at Planday. For those of you that are not familiar with Planday, we are essentially a cloud-based workforce management solution. We support care operators in the care industry to, one, schedule safely and effectively, two, identify and try and reduce any of those unnecessary costs when we know that costs are seeming to go only one way at the moment. Tackle staff retention to make sure that the team are happy, they've got flexibility and they've got the right tools to do their job. And obviously trying to move away from those long, outdated, time-consuming paper-based processes. Obviously, with the aim to give our superstar managers in care that valuable time back so they can really focus on the things that matter and caring for people. I'm confident, and speaking with other leaders in the industry, that with the help of workforce management solutions, care management solutions, EMR systems, and all that other great tech that we're seeing in the industry at the moment, we can help and support CQC with this changing landscape, and we can try to assist in digitalization, trying to drive improvement and obviously drive innovation in the industry. So that being said, that's just everything from my part. I know we've got some great speakers today, and I feel like everybody's going to take a lot of value away from this. So that's everything from me.
That's great. Thank you so much, Adrian. Adrian will be around for the session, so if there are any questions for Planday throughout, as I said, just pop them in the Q&A. Alternatively, you can email them to us and we can forward those on to Adrian, but Adrian will be around and he can come back up on the screen at the end of the session should you have any questions. So I won't gabble on any longer. We're going to introduce you now to Liz Jones, our Policy Director from the National Care Forum. Tim Coolican, who is a partner at Anthony Collins, and also Dave James, who is the head of adult social care policy at CQC. They're going to be taking us through the session. And as I said, any questions, do let us know and we will submit them throughout. So enjoy the session. We'll just wait for Liz to join us. And Tim.
Hello.
It's nice to see you.
Hi folks. Oh, we've got Tim. Have we got Dave? Oh, I can see a black. Oh, I can see a lovely Dave. I can see a smiling Dave. Marvelous.
Right, so I'll let you go, and I'll be popping up and down when we've got questions to submit for you.
Brilliant.
All right.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Lisa. And thank you to Adrian, who's very kindly sponsored the session. So it's great to be here this morning. I'm delighted that we have got the participants of Dave and Tim to help us with our discussion this morning. Well, afternoon actually. So this is gonna be a bit more of a kind of discussion and reflective session. You'll be relieved that we haven't got any slides, so you don't have to sit through lots of slides and listen in that way. we've got a focus on 3 key topics in terms of how we help social care providers navigate the new regulatory landscape. So Dave's going to help us to understand where we're at from a CQC perspective. Tim's going to give us a kind of legal angle and reflection and questions, I guess, and thoughts that we might want to consider together. And obviously, I'll be flying the flag for social care providers and really helping to get to grips with what does this mean for us? What practical things do we need to take away from our discussion today? And our 3 topics are a focus on the timescales, so understanding where we're at between now and when the bigger changes happen towards the end of the year. And Dave's going to help us understand kind of key touch points that we need to be thinking about as providers. And we're going to have a discussion between us about how are we going to help everybody understand what those touch points mean, when they are, whether we need to get ready for them, or whether we're simply responding to them. We're then going to have a bit of insight into the CQC organisational structure, because obviously CQC have had to reshape their organisation quite significantly to be able to respond to the new duties and powers that they have had as a result of the Health and Social Care Act. And we all really want to know on a practical level, what does that mean for us? You know, who do we need to be friends with? What are the new roles? How do we interpret their titles? Who do we talk to if we've got anxieties or concerns or challenges? And then we're going to spend the last half hour or so really trying to focus down on what does it all mean for providers? What are the top tips you should be taking away? We're in March now, so got kind of 6 months-ish to think about being ready for when the CQC are ready to go out into the field formally. So that's how we're going to structure our time. I really would encourage you to put your comments and questions in the chat. We will try and answer them, and I think you will have, as we go along through the discussion, you will have lots of thoughts and you will have questions, and it's really good opportunity while we've got Dave with us, and while we've got Tim from the kind of legal regulatory angle, just to get your questions in. We might not answer them all, we may not know the answers to everything, but if you don't ask, then we won't go and find out. So I'd really encourage you to get your questions in, and we're gonna start, I think. So with our initial topic around the timescales for regulatory reform, I'm going to ask Dave first to just kind of remind us a quick update of where we are and the kind of key points that we need to be watching out for over the next few months, where providers really need to pay attention. You know, we either need to be responding, or we need to be preparing, or we need to be rethinking a bit. So Dave, help us understand where we're at.
Thanks, Liz, and hi everyone. It's nice to be here. Liz set me a brilliant challenge in preparing for today, in coming up with 5 key tips, top tips for providers. I'm going to come to those later on. It will probably be relevant to what I'm talking to now, but it will make more sense to come to that later on in this session. So just to remind you all, really, of what do we mean by the change at CQC. There's 4 broad areas. So new technology in terms of how we use our digital and our IT, but also how providers engage with us and share information with us. New policy, so principally the single assessment framework, which will apply to all health and social care providers, as well as local authorities and wider systems. New ways of organising, as Liz has said, new roles within CQC, multidisciplinary teams, making sure that we're much better able to look across quality across an area, and new powers, again, as Liz has highlighted, in terms of local authority and also integrated care system assessments. You probably are familiar with the single assessment framework. I won't labour it here, just to draw out that it is one framework for everything. Quality statements are we think are much clearer. Certainly the feedback we've had, and we co-produce this framework, much clearer framework than the Chloe's, much more punchy and much shorter, and will allow us to deliver a more balanced scorecard, if you like, in terms of the reports. At the moment, very narrative heavy reports, with ratings at key question level and then overall service level. In the new approach, it'll be really clear for providers and for others reading the report where the areas of strength are and where more focus might be needed, because we'll give a score to each of the 34 quality statements that sit under those 5 key questions. So much more transparency for providers, and that will also support us to be more consistent, which is something we know we want to do and we need to do more work on. So in terms of the new technology, we've already done some work on improving how notifications work. We're doing a lot more work on our provider portal, so it's easier to do business with us, and we're developing a seamless registration through to assessment service. This will be quite transformative as we deliver these aspects of our technology. Just on that portal, this is essentially a one-stop shop for providers, and it is about making it much easier, us providing a better service to providers. When it's fully up and running, providers will be able to register or apply to make changes to their registration through that portal, submit notifications, share information with us, manage their own user accounts, and access and update registration data, and kind of have more flexibility at changing things, where we're able to just give that flexibility. Timelines. Broadly, where we are now, we're continuing to develop our new regulatory approach. There's quite a lot of detail still to work through. We are continuing, of course, to regulate using our current approach, continuing to focus on risk, making sure that we're across risk and quality across health and social care, continuing to do our monthly reviews of services, and stepping into then from that implementation of our new approach, taking a phased approach and making sure that we're really happy to step into the next phase before we do so. So a very measured and controlled approach. How that plays out in practice. So in the spring, this is about putting the technology in place and starting to test that technology with providers, making sure that we're confident in our new regulatory approach, ready to go through that next gate, if you like. In the summer, that's where we'll launch our provider portal. Again, that's in stages, and we'll make sure there's plenty of support and guidance as we start to do that. Initially, that will be around statutory notifications, but also enforcement is an initial area of focus for how the provider portal works. And then towards the end of the year, that's when we start to phase in the single assessment framework, start to use that for our assessments. Providers will be able to register with us and make ongoing changes through the portal at that point, and all online interactions with us will be through the portal. So I think that's all I wanted to say for this first section.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. I can just see a couple of questions in the Q&A before I come to Tim. There's a question from Denise who says, when will the large providers get access to the portal? Is there a distinction? Is there any?
I can check that though. I can check that.
Would it be any different for large ones to small ones, or?
Not sure that it would be, no. But I can check that. Okay.
And then Violet's asked about the 34 quality statements. I think there's a little bit of confusion there between the quality statements and the evidence categories. So perhaps let's hang on to that thought, and then if we've got time, we can towards the end we can do a quick recap of the structure of the new assessment framework. I just remember there's quality statements, there's evidence categories, there's all of those things. So let's not go down that one now, but we'll hold that one for later if we've got time. Tim, reflections, questions, thoughts, top tips.
Thank you very much. I suppose the first reflection and the first concern is this. One of the biggest problems that providers have faced over the course of the last 2 years, maybe 2 or 3 years, has been that sort of lingering problem in relation to historic requires improvement ratings. So we have dozens, if not hundreds of people that we speak to who were last inspected pre-pandemic. For understandable reasons, there was a delay in the inspection regime during the course of the pandemic, and then looking at the CQC's risk-based approach to selecting which services are going to be inspected, there are still many services who've got a requires improvement rating from 4 years ago, which bears no reflection whatsoever in relation to the service at the present time. Obviously, one of the answers to that we were promised was going to be the new inspection and rating regime, and that through the continual assessment in relation to a wide range of evidence, the CQC would be able to update and refresh ratings on a more regular basis. Obviously, what we've seen since then, or since that was announced, has been the delay in terms of the rollout of the new regulatory and rating process, which builds in yet another 12 months delay before any of those services are likely to have their rating revisited. We've certainly spoken to providers during the course of the last 2 or 3 months who've been raising the question with the CQC, well, if there's going to be a delay of 12 months, does that mean that we're going to get an old-fashioned inspection in the meantime? To which the answer for all of the clients that we've spoken to has been a resolute no. You're going to have to wait for the new system. And then added to that is a concern that the new approach also appears, from what we know about it, to take a fair amount of time before it's going to build up a full picture in relation to the service. So if you look at the timetable for review of different evidence categories, you can see that there's a proposal to speak to the people being supported perhaps once a year, that you will speak to staff and leaders in the service every 2 years, and that observation of care and the care environment might only happen every 3 years. Now, I'll look to Dave for some reassurance in relation to that, but those are dates and timetables which are given on slides which have been circulated by the CQC. And our interpretation of that is, okay, you might start to build up a refreshed picture in relation to a service during the course of that cycle of re-rating, but you are not going to build up a full picture in relation to the service until you've gone through that full cycle. So as with targeted and focused inspections over the course of the last 2 years, there is a risk of building up a sort of an incomplete picture of the service, so that poor provider who's been in a position of having a requires improvement rating for 4 years, which doesn't reflect the service, there is a risk that that's going to take much longer than anyone would want before it's resolved. The second concern in relation to the timing is, when are we actually going to get a really clear understanding of what this means in practice? So 2 years ago, we had the announcement of the CQC's new regulatory approach, some aims and objectives, which I think everybody would say were good, which were aimed in the right direction. But in terms of the transitional approach over the last 2 years, frankly, it took about 6 months, 12 months to work out what it really meant in practice. So if you're a provider, how can you prepare for that? How can you make sure that you're doing all of the things to ensure that you can articulate and share with the CQC the great things that you're doing within the service? If you don't know what they're looking for and what in practice is going to help, how can you make sure that they get a fair picture when they come along and investigate a concern raised with them, for example, by somebody being supported? And in the same way, the slides, the ethos, the message behind the new regulatory regime sounds great, but when we're asked what does it mean in practice, I'm still scratching my head in terms of being able to say this is precisely what you do to ensure that you're well placed going forward.
I think people have understood, well, mostly understood the kind of structure of the new assessment framework that you're thinking about, and I think there's a lot of I think people welcome the quality statements and that focus on, you know, the I and the we, because that makes it very clear, doesn't it, as an individual, what you expect from the care and support that you're getting, and as providers we can think about the world from that perspective, obviously. And then there's the in the broader frameworks, there's understanding what we do, what our commitments in the quality statements, for the we statements. But I think trying to bring it to life for providers is a bit of a challenge. It's that kind of, what should they feel like they should be doing something now, and what could they most usefully do now. And then I think the rating question that Tim's mentioned, that sort of delay, it's a real challenge for providers where they've got services that have got an inadequate requires improvement, and they feel, that actually that isn't reflective of what they're offering now, and what can they do in the current arrangements to ask the regulator to get another look at that, and how much capacity, I guess, have you got to respond to those anxieties and that question? Because obviously you're going through quite a lot of change yourselves, and there's a big structural change and a big policy and practice change. So I guess you will have been reflecting on these in the CQC yourself, won't you, with your colleagues, Dave? So what are your thoughts about those two challenges?
Yeah, I mean, so the development of the new approach and the restructure doesn't impact on our ability to carry out inspections. As you'd expect, the fine line we have to tread really is making sure that fees are proportionate and we have sufficient capacity to get out there for what is a large market of around 24,000 services. A big part of the changes that we are bringing in is making sure that we can get out there much more frequently and update information, whether that's the overarching rating or the ability that we'll have to actually focus on specific areas and give more clarity on where improvements have been made. I don't know if I'm misunderstanding what I've heard, but we won't need to go out and redo everyone that's been rated. We've got that baseline. So anyone that's been inspected and rated, that is carried over, and then it's a question of updating that. There is the focus at the moment is on the kind of schedules of that. I know Tim mentioned those slides, which those timeframes are just illustrative. It was just to get across the idea that we'll be clearer on how it's feasible to mix older information with newer. So the obvious example would be the strategy of an organization doesn't need to be looked at every time, but we want to be making sure that we're staying in touch with people's experiences. So what's the right cadence for just keeping an up-to-date view? And we don't need to have gone through that, whatever it was, the 3-year cycle to then know everything about that service. It's actually about how often do things change? How often do we need to be either visiting or asking for updated information from providers? We are still inspecting at the moment. Yeah, kind of within our capacity, we're still delivering inspections as well as reviewing what we know about providers through the DMA process, the direct monitoring process. In terms of the detail of what it means in practice, I mean, we're still 6 months away from even the start of this, and it will be an increasing picture. So that detail will come. I don't know if anybody's been looking across the fence to what's happened with local authorities, where we're about to start piloting our new approach for local authorities in the next couple of weeks, and regrettably only just managed to be able to publish our assessment framework. That is not an indication of what's going to happen with providers. That is purely down to government approvals holding up our engagement and our communication. We're not fettered by government in our provider work, so there'll be a good 3 months before it actually applies to you as a provider, whereby there'll be sufficient information out there to make sure you know what it means for you. I'm just wondering if I covered all the points there. Have I missed anything from?
I would just say, yeah, I just go back to the baselining point, I think. So yes, I mean, most people, unless you're a very new service, have had an inspection, and you know, they have as you would call it, a baselining rating. I guess if you feel that baselining rating is really very out of date, and you know, you were thinking that there would be an opportunity to have that looked at again because the new assessment framework was going to come in sooner than it can. So you've got another 6 months before that's potentially a goer, unless you're on the schedules of inspections now. I guess it's that anxiety that providers have, that they may have done a lot of hard work to really respond to the things that were raised in the baseline inspection, however many months or years ago, and there isn't that. There isn't an obvious way to kind of have an opportunity to demonstrate that to the regulator, and to then have their rating revised overall, their overall rating, because we know that people pay attention to the word, whether it's good, inadequate, requires improvement, or outstanding. That's the thing that the public look at often.
Yeah, and that is what we're trying to fix. It really is, and it will be frustrating, I know, because this is business critical information for providers. But that is the problem we're trying to solve, essentially, with this, with the policy shift, with the organisational redesign, is to be able to be more efficient and effective with the resources that we've got at our disposal as a fees funded organisation. But it is going to take time to get that right, or else we're going to come out half cocked, and no one will thank us for that either. So I think it's just making sure we've got the time to do this properly, and in a phased way.
Tim, anything to say? I'm just looking at the Q&A, Dave, because there's a couple of quite interesting questions about the parallels with the Ofsted experience this week. So I'm going to forewarn you, and then we'll probably come back to that if we've got time at the end, just to, yeah.
I mean, my only comment was to say that certainly from our perspective, that problem in terms of historic requires improvement ratings is, I think, far bigger than is being acknowledged. And we certainly have clients who've had that rating for years who are absolutely begging for re-inspection. It felt that there was an opportunity in terms of the winter discharge plan to try and get up the queue, but for whatever reason, they weren't perhaps on the list put forward by local authorities. That limited opportunity wasn't available to them. And in every conversation they've had with their contacts at the CQC, they are being told that realistically there is no hope of an old style re-inspection which will lift their rating before the new scheme comes in. So if there is one plea, it's to try and make sure that there is a real focus on trying to address that problem either before the new scheme comes in, or ideally, sorry, not ideally, but if failing that, once the new scheme is in place.
Yeah, and a couple of points in the Q&A actually backing that up. So a few people in the Q&A are interested in the CQC's reflections and possible actions. What does it say? In light of the recent headlines regarding Ofsted and the death of Ms. Perry, a head teacher. And I have no doubt that the CQC will have been reflecting on that, because people will see a lot of parallels. So we'll park that for now, but I think lots of people will, I'm sure lots of people have probably asked the CQC already, and I'm pretty sure the CQC leadership will have given some thought to the I guess the media attention that all of that has had in the headlines this week, before we had Boris, obviously. But earlier in the week, there was a lot of discussion, and a lot of old chief inspectors of Ofsted, actually, I heard trotted out on the radio talking about balancing the difficulties between trying to help parents understand what quality the inspectors feel the school is offering versus the pressures that are on in that case teachers, and the consequences actually. So if we've got a bit of time towards the end, I think we'll have some reflections, because I know people will be interested. But I'd like to move us on now, because our second topic is about understanding the kind of new look CQC. So obviously we all understand that the CQC has restructured itself to be ready and prepared for its new powers, its new responsibilities. And we're all quite excited about those new responsibilities, actually. I know providers think that it's a good thing that there's going to be some objective view of how local authorities are delivering against their Care Act duties, and the opportunity to have a voice in that, and also the advocacy that a lot of our members, and I'm sure a lot of the providers on the call, do for the people they support. So I think that, we all feel that's a step forward, actually, in terms of the sort of triangulation of regulation and oversight. And equally for integrated care systems, so much responsibility is being devolved to them. And, you know, as a person living in the locality of an integrated care system, it's very reassuring to know that there's going to be some regulatory assurance about how they use those enormous powers and responsibilities. So I think we're all looking forward to that, and we understand that actually that means you need to reshape who does what, how you're structured. So from our point of view, it'd be great to understand kind of what you think are the key roles that providers need to be aware of in the new structure, and, you know, who do we make friends with, who do we need to build relationships with within those roles, who might come and talk to us so we understand what those roles might be wanting from us, and if we've got concerns or challenges, who do we go to raise those challenges or concerns? Who does what, and who do we need to know? I guess is what we're after.
Thanks, Liz. So again, this is early. So these roles are still being set up, and teams are still bedding in. So plenty more will come on this, but I'm very happy to outline it. You may have heard the change that we made kind of structurally in terms of our operational delivery teams and what we're calling regulatory leadership. So our Chief Inspector, Kate Tironi, and her senior team sit in regulatory leadership, and operational delivery across all of health and social care now sits with Tyson Heppel, our Executive Director of Operations. Regulatory leadership will do a lot of that. Will be much more where kind of the specialist knowledge and skills sit, and will be support for the operational teams, so that we're less reliant on kind of reams of guidance and actually able to plug into that expertise of skills that sit in regulatory leadership. That will also be a bit like my role in the policy side, quite an outwardly focused role as well. Where we were before this is that my colleagues in the operational directorate had to split their time between that more sort of strategic, outward-facing, influencing, relationship building work, and also day-to-day delivery. So as with a lot of the changes actually that I'm about to outline, it's very much about just really allowing people to focus on more sensible and discrete areas of work and structuring ourselves in a more helpful way. I'll just mention, actually, as you've mentioned, the local authority and the integrated care system work there, Liz. As things stand, the assessment teams for those new powers are actually going to sit in that regulatory leadership function. I don't know if that will be permanent, but as we're in the stage of piloting and development, that's where the assessment teams will sit for now, rather than out in the regions. What else can I helpfully tell you?
Key roles.
Yes, so key roles.
Yeah, because people are used to kind of going, we talk to our inspector, or we talk to the inspection manager, and you know, people ask us for information, and we know who they are, and we know why they want it, and all that.
So the inspection manager is an operations manager is the new role, but it's and whether that role's remit will change is still to be determined, but my sense is it's not a significant amount of change there. So there'll still be that role there, that inspection manager role. Perhaps a more significant change is the split of what we're calling an assessor and an inspector. So I'll talk through those two roles now. So the assessor is a sector specialist, and they're accountable for the ongoing view of quality and safety and risk for services in their portfolio. They make judgments as part of assessment. They work with the inspector and others to make sure that evidence is available and supports that assessment activity. They decide on and authorize regulatory activity, and they are more focused on the kind of off-site evidence collection aspect. So it's more of a kind of at the ranch role in that sense. Whereas the inspector, also sector specialists, so we're not going back to generalists. That's an important point to make that we had a few years ago. So social care inspectors are just that, they are sector specialists, very much focused on site visits, gathering the kind of evidence that you can only get through physical inspection. They would lead any enforcement activity that may need to be carried out. So that's another challenge we have when we do have concerns and we have to take enforcement action, that can really just knock for six any kind of plan or schedule that an inspector would have had in their plans, and we're just trying to, again, just split out the work in more sensible, manageable ways. They would work with providers, so the inspector is still a source of contact and a person that a provider would know and deal with. I think there's probably a question for us still to come to, which is how does that best work for larger providers? Inspector for small, medium-sized providers makes sense. How do we build on and develop our role when we work with providers that are larger scale? How can we do that better? That's something that we will be looking at. There's a new role called a regulatory coordinator as well. They will also be somebody that particularly the small and medium-sized services providers would work with. As well as being a point of contact for providers, they would kind of do outreach type work, so working with local provider groups and other local groups to gather information. So that feedback from partners evidence category would be something that a coordinator would be feeding. They would support the triage of information as it flows to us, supporting the collection of evidence, and they would have a role as well in planning inspections and how inspections are delivered. And then I mentioned earlier the regulatory leadership part of, so this is separate to operational delivery. So the inspection manager, the assessor, and the inspector, that's all operational delivery. And then in our regulatory leadership function, we've got what we're calling senior specialists. So they are a source of support for those operational teams. They provide the more in-depth expert advice, particularly where there might be complexity or really high-risk issues. And so they're there to support that decision making, and may well work externally as well, particularly with perhaps more senior stakeholders. So those are the operational roles as they sit.
So we've got the assessor, we've got the inspector,
yeah,
and we've got the coordinator.
Yeah.
So those might be the roles. I know there's some lovely jazzy slides on the CQC website. I can see someone in the Q&A said, can we have a
yes
picture? Yes, we can, because it's on the
reading
website.
some slides now, actually, so I'm very happy to send these.
I think we can point people, and we can share. Obviously, I'm sure Lisa and the team can share the slide, and the slides are really helpful. But I got a bit overwhelmed by all the different roles when I was listening a few months ago. So we've got the assessor, who we need to be familiar with. We've got the inspector, who's the person who might actually turn up, and we've got the coordinator, who we might do, who might want to get us involved in some outreach work, or we might want them to do some outreach work, and they'll do planning. And so that's those three key roles. And then those three key roles that are all seen as operational roles will have access to this regulatory leadership expertise within the CQC if there are issues that need that expert advice.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I've got that. Tim, any reflections? Because I know that you work a lot with providers who've had a lot of contact with their regulatory teams, their inspection teams, and we know that relationships matter, don't we? I mean, obviously facts and evidence matter, but relationships matter, and kind of understanding the context and the environment in which people are operating is also really important, isn't it? So from your perspective, any reflections, any questions?
Yes, and I think trying to be as positive as I can be, it seems to me that the new structure potentially gives the advantage of building up greater levels of expertise, greater levels of understanding in relation to particular services in a geographical area or particular types of service. And I think that is absolutely vital, because so often there appears to be a lack of understanding, particularly in the types of cases that we see where perhaps something's gone wrong, and therefore, someone's asking for our assistance in turning around a requires improvement or inadequate rating, or in relation to enforcement action. And quite often from our clients' perspective, they're hugely frustrated, to say the least, because they feel there's just been a lack of understanding in relation to the reality of care, and equally perhaps a lack of understanding in relation to the pressures that are being put upon providers in terms of staffing and in relation to funding. And I think, combined with probably the role of the CQC now in inspecting local authorities, which we hope will help ground the whole of the CQC's work in the real world, what the challenges are that are being faced by providers. I think a greater level of understanding and a higher level of skill on the part of inspectors, assessors, all of the varying roles will be a good thing. Having tried to be as positive as I can be, I'm a regulatory lawyer, so equally probably need to sort of pick at some of the holes and some of the concerns that we've got. And I think it's a combination of the speed and the extent of the change in terms of the processes, combined with the fact that we're going to have a huge number of people taking on new roles and responsibilities. So again, try not to be too rude in relation to this. Certainly there have been announcements from the CQC in relation to the timing with which details would be announced. So one of the phrases was, we're not going to announce it all in one go. We will be drip feeding information in relation to the changes as they're being implemented, which, if I'm being mischievous, I interpret as we're making it up as we go along, and therefore we can't tell you until we've worked out what it is we're going to do. And clearly there has been a great pace to the change for good reason, but that does mean we've got an organisational as a whole which is implementing a vastly different system to the one that came before. On top of that, we have this huge range of staff who are being put into new roles or working with new colleagues who are being asked to implement that new system. It does seem to me that carries with it a huge risk, and it's a risk that the CQC has always faced, and I think would accept is one of its greatest problems, which is consistency of regulatory decision making. It's an issue which was called out by the CQC's auditors. It is an issue which providers complain to us about on a very regular basis. Credit where it's due, Kate Roney was speaking at Care England's conference last week and accepted that one of the big challenges was transparency and consistency. And it does seem to me that with all of the change coming, both in terms of structure and in terms of staffing, that consistency issue is going to be an even greater problem. Combine that with the fact that under the new system, we're no longer grading on 4 big bands. Fundamentally, we're going almost towards percentage scores, where it seems to me that differences of opinion between different inspection teams could end up being magnified or at least even more visible. If you're only having to choose fundamentally between 4 different gradings, you should be able to drive a level of consistency. But if everything is now being rated on a scale from 1 to 100, even if that ends up in a box of still being good, requires improvement or inadequate, then I think we're going to find providers being even more concerned in relation to the judgments made. So alongside the CQC's or the details on the CQC's website in relation to the new roles for the inspection teams, you'll also see a mock-up of the new rating report, which will still have those familiar color-coded good, requires improvement, etc., but at the same time has got your hotel style percentage score alongside it with a neat up and down arrow telling you whether it's gone up or gone down since the last assessment. That feels to me ripe to make providers who feel that their score isn't right or their score's gone down to be even more concerned than they were before in relation to consistency. And I think that brings me back, just before I finish, to one of our greatest pleas, which is for real clarity in relation to what the process to challenge these judgments is going to be. Because without a really rigorous, fair, and I would say independent system to challenge the judgments being made by inspectors and inspection teams, there is going to be nothing which will moderate the decisions that are being reached, push them all back into shape, and arguably that would assist, I think, in resolving the CQC's problem with consistency.
So it's always fun with a regulatory lawyer.
We like to try and make it as fun as it possibly can
It's
be.
always fun. Well, the thing is, when Tim asks us questions, we know that he's thought about them quite carefully, and they're based on lots of experience and anxiety of people up against it, really. So let's take the, let's work back. Let's take the challenge question. What's going to be the process for challenge? And then let's go on to the consistency and the transparency, because I know that that's part of the rationale for the new assessment approach, actually, Dave. So let's talk about the challenge bit first. What do providers do if they, in the new world, if they really don't agree with the judgments that that the inspection team have reached?
We're improving the processes, but essentially the same avenues would remain. So issues of factual accuracy, that process needs to be overhauled. I don't think it's a helpful process for us or for providers, but that opportunity to point out where we've made factual errors would still be there, and the ratings review process is still there. But I think what the more structured approach offers is, it's really interesting to hear Tim's reflections on kind of pulling back the sheets and as kind of showing our working out actually might be a source of anxiety. I've always thought of it as being a comfort and increasing transparency and increasing visibility for us where judgments differ, actually, because at the moment we just don't have that. We've got a sea of words essentially, and we're just not able to do that quality management piece ourselves effectively enough. Whereas if we're looking region by region or patch by patch, whatever it might be, and we're looking at a topic, say medication, how is that being scored and how is that coming out differently? It just gives us more visibility of when we might have issues of consistency. But the more structured framework and the clarity around the evidence categories, so there's only 6 instead of 335 key lines of inquiry, and who knows which ones were asked and which ones weren't, will actually be transparent as to, for your type of service, it's these evidence categories that we will maintain a view on, up to 6, and often it won't be all 6. If you as a provider feel that the current rating and assessment isn't appropriate, then we can take further information, we can take further evidence. We don't need to come and do a full comprehensive inspection. We can review that evidence within. I need to be very careful not to promise that there's just someone sitting at CQC waiting for things to be sent to them. Again, going back to the need to balance our fee structure with our ability to do our job and have the right capacity. But it ought to be easier to submit fresh information that allows us to assess based on that new information. So everything really is geared up to having a more structured approach, more clarity, more transparency, and finding a way to allow us to use our resources more effectively to reflect where improvement has happened. It's a big part of what we're here to do. It's a cornerstone of our strategy that we're here to accelerate and support improvement. And that's about how we deliver our assessments, but it's also, I think there's a big piece of work to do about, well, what skills do we need? How do we work with providers in other ways? How do we think around this in a broader sense? What's our improvement offer, if you like? There's a lot of work that we'll be doing around that as well. It's not just about what's the model that we use. It's also, our behaviours. Was there a second?
Well, yeah, I think it's going to be a challenge. It's interesting. Tim and I had discussed that kind of, so when you're a customer, and having been a customer very recently of social care services for my parents, what the regulator says matters, but also other practical things matter, like who's available, what's in the locality, what do they sound like when you talk to them in home care world anyway. So, I mean, it does matter. But then Tim and I were discussing, well, if I was looking for a home care provider for my mum and dad, and there was one that was good, and it was, it had scores of 80%, and actually there was another one that was good and it had scores of 60% in the, you know, within the parameters. Which one would I be wanting to try and ask to support my parents? And inevitably we'd probably prefer the higher score person, wouldn't we? Organise provider. So I think it's there are probably some things to navigate in the level, the granularity, but also it's really important that you have that ability as an organisation to provide consistent granularity. I think that's probably where we're a bit worried. I think, I don't know, Tim, is there anything based on kind of the ambitions that the CQC have got for the new approach and trying to deliver that an easier way for them to be assured around transparency and consistency? Because, you know, it's a big operation, isn't it? Is there anything you reflect?
I think the biggest thing that they could do is have a truly independent appeals process. It won't come as any surprise to Dave, because I think I've said it in meetings at which we've both been present before. Arguably, I think if there were a truly independent appeals process in relation to ratings, then it would probably do the lawyers out of work, because the appeals process would actually knock the judgments back into shape. And then the decision making that's guided by those appeal judgments would probably be more robust, would be more consistent, and it would be much harder for lawyers like us to come along and say, no, we think you have got an argument in relation to inaccuracy in relation to the report, or we think that you've got an argument around the proportionality between the way that you're being rated and a very similar service is being rated. But, you know, you appear to have ended up with requires improvement and they've ended up with good. And I think that is my concern in relation to the percentage score approach. Totally understand Dave's perspective, that it shows the working out and perhaps helps people to understand exactly why they've landed up in one category rather than another. But I think when anybody is judged on a percentage basis, you always start comparing yourself with other people that you think are in a similar position. And I think in the same way that we have providers who are saying, why am I good rather than outstanding, because I think I'm the same as this service down the road. I think, as Liz says, you're going to have people saying, well, okay, I'm happy that I'm good, but I'm really unhappy that I'm a 60% good rather than a 79% good. And I think that probably is, I'm now going to smile, going to create work for lawyers, because I think a lot of people are going to want to challenge those sorts of ratings.
Thoughts, Dave?
Yes, interesting perspective. I think what will be helpful for those cases where there's, you know, let's say that there's that 10% difference or whatever, it's actually, okay, well, what's driving this? What is it? Is it about staff well-being? Is it about medications? And knowing the evidence that we've looked at and being able to hold us to account for the evidence that we look at, because we'll publish what the required evidence is. Considering, well, what is it within that that's driven that judgment? You know, is it the processes? Is it about the policies that we've considered? Is it about the people's experiences? Is it what we've heard from Local Health Watch or other partners? Is it feedback from staff? What is it that's driven? And we'll be structuring our report around those evidence categories, so that, again, it's kind of clear how that's contributed to each of the topics. I don't think any of that completely negates or answers Tim's concerns here, but I think it'd be interesting to see how if this pushes the dial further towards where we all want it to be, which is more consistency. But because the trick we have to pull off is consistency without turning this into a tick box exercise where we stifle any kind of innovation. It's that really difficult balance of judgment and dealing with every case as a unique case, but doing so in a consistent way. This will at least give us better data to be able to expose where we're not consistent, and also gives providers and the public more information to go on without reading a lot of words in our reports.
A lot of words. There are a lot of words. So I'm just having a quick look at the Q&A because there's quite some quite interesting points in there. So there's a couple of Q&A observations just about difficulties, you know, and unhappiness with their ability to challenge CQC. And I'm guessing that, you know, actually there are processes, there are the factual accuracy processes at the moment, and there are the ratings review processes. I guess if you're still not happy, Dave, what do you do at the moment? Who do you talk to if you're still not happy? Well, is there anyone who can have a conversation with you if you feel that neither of those processes have worked for you? What do you do?
So I'm not in an operational role, so I don't know how that plays out in practice. I don't know. I mean, I guess it would depend on the basis of you not being happy. If it's gone through two stages of checks, we've recently just been challenged on our factual accuracy process, and it's in the courts, and we're found in our favour that it is an independent and a fair, proportionate process. The ratings review process is open there. It's difficult to kind of apply to. Is it just that someone just doesn't accept the judgment, which is an uncharitable reading of the problem that's just been put to me, or is it that there's a case here in which case then it's people such as Tim who can help, I suppose.
So the comment was from Stella, who said, we've had homes who've tried to challenge and wanted to submit extra evidence, but the CQC haven't wanted it.
So this new approach should make that easier to submit new evidence, and allows us to consider and deal with it. Again, I'm being very careful here not to promise any kind of super responsive service.
No, I know you're not in charge of all of that, but there will be. I mean, I guess people would have thought about it. Yeah. I do. I mean, I think there is some merit in thinking about how to take some of the tension out of all of this, and the independent, the ombudsman type approach might be worth some consideration. I just think it is an area of huge tension. And actually, just looking at some of the other questions in the chat. So Steve mentions about stakeholders and relationships, and you know how it's quite tricky to. I'm presuming that means relationships with the CQC. It's quite tricky to maintain those relationships because people, you know, there's big turnover of folks. So you might be working with somebody who's only just moved into a role, and you know it might not be the information that the CQC might be asking for might not be actually the information that is needed, that the provider needs to submit. He says you could be asking an evidence question of someone who's only just engaged with a provider, therefore not getting the answers you A, might want, B, might be useful, and C, might reduce the quality expected of a service or what the service deserves. So I guess there's something there about how the CQC thinks it might manage that sort of new relationship building and that awareness and understanding of why evidence is being sought and what it's actually for. I think there's something there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's been a huge driver for the single assessment framework. Again, it goes back to consistency, but also making sure we're focusing on the right things when we are on site in residential services. We'll be transparent on what the required evidence is. Providers can hold us to account. If you've got an inspector who's just trying to think of a good example. I mean, the perennial challenge is to focus on the right amount of policies, procedures, type evidence versus what's actually happening, what we're hearing from people, including people that work at the service and who are running the service. We haven't always got that balance right, and being transparent on how much is enough. Again, I think this is some work that we're doing at the moment, and we want to be clearer on, for our staff, but as well as for providers as well, how much evidence is enough. When do we need to stop digging, but also how much does the provider need to offer, and how will it be taken into account? If implementing this well means everybody's got a shared and clear understanding of that, and our guidance is clear enough for us to be able to hold our inspection team or assessment teams to account, but equally for providers to be able to see that we're not following our processes, and to be able to hold us to account as well. But it is also about good relationships.
Yeah,
absolutely, and an understanding of context, and I do think that the local authority work will be transformative in that regard, because in that part of our work, the provider then becomes the partner in the feedback from partners evidence category. What we learn from provider regulation, but also through our engagement with providers, feeds into that evidence category for the local authority assessment. So it all joins up in that way, and allows us to take what we've heard from providers, either through conversation or, as I say, just through the very act of assessment and regulation, and play that into how is that local authority working with providers in the area? How is it discharging its care act duties, and how is that impacting on what people are getting at the end of all that?
So hold that thought, because there's a question in the chat about how we can get involved in the local authority reviews. Donna asks, when will we know who will be our inspection teams? We've been told the team we currently are under is changing, but they don't know any more details. So what do we, when can we start to build those relationships in the new world? I can't actually remember. I remember somebody said April, Dave, but when do we officially know?
I don't know. That's yeah, I think can I take that away, because I think there's movement on that, and
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Somebody said people were officially moving into roles on the 3rd of April, but then I don't know what that means in.
I don't know if that means
yeah,
externally. That's why I'm just hesitating there. Yeah.
Gillian's got a specific question about scoring.
Mm.
Are the percentage scores allocated going to be done as a clearly defined mark that can be achieved by doing X, Y, Z in a similar way to education, with a mark scheme published to providers for clarity, or is it more likely to have a subjective quality where the percentage score and numbers are used more as a way to rank providers in order? Are you going to rank providers? No.
But one thing we heard from providers when we first started developing this model was that they wanted to be able to benchmark themselves much more easily, which was one reason why we are keen to put out a scored approach for quality statements. So it's kind of that transparency point. So speaking as someone who took three attempts to get GCSE maths, even for me, although I should hesitate to say this, the maths is simple and straightforward. It's essentially the number of the sum of the scores divided by the complete possible number of scores. So it's a percentage in that sense. So a 4-point scale, just as we have with our ratings, with 1 being essentially down the inadequate end of practice, and 4 being something exceptional and innovative that's happening in relation to a quality statement. Does that answer the question though? So it will be transparent, and the bandings that are applied to that will be clear and published as well, so you'd know how it is that you get how it tips the rating essentially when it's aggregated up to the rating level.
Okay, I'm just looking at the Q&A. Right, I want to hold the thought about getting involved in local authority reviews, and also there's an interesting comment in the Q&A about some of the ways that the NHS is working. So let's hold that thought, because our next discussion is, and I think we can weave it in, our next topic is around being ready to planning for this year. And I think there's quite a lot of questions in the chat that might help us just work through some of our thoughts. So before I go to the chat, Dave, from your point of view, my challenge of the 5 top tips, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
In fact, I will own up, my colleague in our engagement team helped me with this, and he was actually very grateful. He thought it was a brilliant challenge to set. So you're going to see more of these. We should give you credit. Each time they're rolled out, we should give you credit. So the 5 top tips. I don't think these have been in any order, actually. I didn't ask him, but so please look out for any opportunities to get involved. Get involved in any engagement opportunities is the first one here. Do keep an eye out for the guidance that we'll publish and the information that we'll publish. Please do discuss the changes with your colleagues and your networks and your groups. And what it doesn't say here, but absolutely do feed that back through trade associations such as the wonderful National Care Forum. Speak to your local CQC team, even if that is going to change in the future. You still have those links, so please do feel free to speak to your team, and please do sign up to the provider portal. That will be how we're doing business. So when that opportunity presents itself, then yes, please do that. Those are the 5 tips that we've.
So get involved, watch out for the guidance, discuss and share and tell us if you're an NCF member. We're always listening. Speak to your local team and make sure you've signed up to the portal. I presume everyone should get the bulletin as well, shouldn't they? Everyone should have the CQC bulletin. Okay. Tip.
Liz, I was going to say, can I jump in just with some top tips? Before we do that, I wanted to sympathise with Dave. My ability in relation to maths, I think, probably equals yours, and maybe we can take the moment to celebrate International Maths Day. It clearly wasn't going to be for us. But seriously, in terms of tips, I think what we would say is that in preparing, providers have really got to think about the evidence that they can collate in relation to good practice. Coming back to my slightly cynical self, we are concerned about the extent to which the new inspection process may continue some of the things that we've felt unhappy about under the current transitional approach, so that almost if you have a deconstructed approach to the old style inspection, there are going to be things that are going to be missed. Equally, if you are driven by, quite rightly, the concerns being raised by people being supported and their families, there is a risk of unconscious bias drifting into the inspection process, so that if inspectors are told that there's a problem, that's what they're going to be looking for. So I think providers need to be collating a very, very wide evidence base in relation to everything that it's good, so that they are ready to present that to the inspection team when they arrive. And I think that's linked to my second point in terms of how people can prepare. One of the aims that was set out by the CQC in changing its regulatory approach 2 years ago, which I think everyone would agree with, is putting people who are being supported at the heart of the regulatory approach. They're the most important people in the entire care sector. They are the people, the local authorities have got obligations to support. So it is vital that the regulator is doing a really good job to make sure that they are receiving the quality of care that they deserve. But one of the risks, as I've just outlined, is that people don't necessarily give an accurate portrayal in relation to the service that they're receiving. They may be raising complaints in relation to the care provider, which really ought to be addressed to the local authority in terms of commissioning practice. And therefore, there is that risk that complaints and concerns reported to the CQC will trigger an inspection, and there will be perhaps an inappropriate focus to look for evidence to back up that concern. So again, the next tip that we would give is to use your complaints processes, to use whistleblowing processes, using whatever means you can to talk to the people that you're supporting, to talk to your staff, to get hold of issues early. And even if you think that the complaints that are being raised or the concerns that are being raised aren't justified, to treat them just as seriously as if you uncovered the worst safeguarding issue that you've ever encountered, to make sure that you are double checking that the training you're giving to staff in that area, the guidance you're providing, the quality of care that's being given is absolutely first class, so that if the CQC do come and try and investigate or look to investigate the concern that's been raised with them, you are ready to demonstrate to them that it is an area in which you excel. My third tip, and I'm only going to give 3 tips, is to come back to the point about what do you do if you're unhappy with the challenges that you put into the CQC in relation to factual accuracy and rating review, and arguably what do you do before you put those challenges in, which is to find yourself a good lawyer. I would say that. I would say that, of course.
I didn't realise this was a recruiting ground, Tim.
but the case that I think Dave has referred to, which said that the CQC's processes were fair, I probably don't want to comment too much publicly in relation to that, but I think there are better cases that could be brought, which would demonstrate more clearly some of the concerns that we've got in relation to the CQC's approach. And therefore, the routes that you can look at beyond rating review and factual accuracy submission are to bring a challenge in the court, to bring a complaint to the Parliamentary and the Health Services Ombudsman. That's certainly something that we assist clients with, and is the closest thing that we've got to that independent route to challenge, which we feel is so badly needed to try and drive consistency into the CQC's regulatory approach.
Thank you. I got more tips than I was bargaining for. That's excellent. We might actually craft them into a top tips somewhere and pop them on the website. I think that's a good idea. So there is, in the chat, there is quite a lot of anxiety about this point of the fact that generally people tend to give more negative feedback than positive, and that might well sway the CQC view. Donna suggests that CQC systems are weighted against, are weighted for negative feedback. So how do we make sure the CQC are hearing everything? And people are happier to complain than they are to promote positive feedback. And I know we've talked about that quite a lot. I know I'm more likely to complain than praise, although actually having had those conversations, I've started thinking about praising. But they've also had concerns which were malicious and had no grounds, but that all took a lot of energy. And kind of alongside that, Steve's talking about balancing that feedback and how people view it, and the idea that the inspector might have had a bad day. And so there's a bit of there is definitely anxiety in the chat about how we, with that focus on feedback from people and their families, how do we not get into a sort of spiral of doom and actually encourage people to provide that positivity? And how do we help our CQC teams to help us with that, I guess?
Yeah, I thought Tim's tips were really good, and the one particularly on kind of build your evidence. There's actually a quality statement on this that effectively requires you to do this. Actively seek feedback and tell us how the service has been improved and changed as a result. We'd love to hear that. The focus on people's experiences isn't new. Strategically, we've been talking about this for a long time. I'll be honest, we've never really fully achieved it. We talk about putting people at the center. In practice, it's easier to look at policies. It's easier to mark things down through that route. Is one way of looking at how things have panned out. But we are committed to making sure that we use people's feedback better and ensure the system acts on it. But we have been regulating for some time now. We know our teams will know how to differentiate between kind of malicious and spurious complaints, but crucially that we corroborate across all the evidence, which, as I say, will be clear which evidence categories apply. The quality statement score will be based on a balanced view across that. So it shouldn't ever be the case that you know, that we're just purely going off some complaints where everything else is pointing to good practice. And again, I think the clarity of the quality statements and the commitment that they articulate for providers to live up to, I would really hope just make it easier to have confidence in that process, and to have confidence and to know what to do. And that would be backed up also with us being clearer on what is the best practice standards and guidance that we're relying on. You know, what is the nice guidance that sits below that level of the quality statement? What is it that actually just builds out the detail? What does good look like at that slightly more detailed level? But certainly for that feedback point, as I say, there's a quality statement there. I think it's really clear. Please do that, and allow us to come in and celebrate your service.
I think it is all about celebration, actually. I mean, obviously you've got to inspect for risk, but that sense that we're in it together to try and improve is really, I think, something we need to hang on to. Perhaps that has been a bit less visible while we had COVID. So there's a few questions in the Q&A that are really around the kind of the broader powers that you're going to have. So there's quite a lot of enthusiasm for understanding how to contribute to local authority reviews from Kim. She's interested in that. And Sandra makes a really interesting point about the NHS setting up virtual wards and the prominence of the enhanced health in care homes framework, and a kind of sense that in some places it works well and in other places it's very directive and being kind of done to and not with, which can be an NHS problem, let's face it. So there, I guess, both in the local authority assurance and the ICS assurances, will you be looking at that kind of, at the different angles of the working in partnership and stakeholder feedback? How can we kind of be ready to get involved?
Yeah, really good question. We're going to start. We're about to start piloting in 5 local authority areas, or up to 5 local authority areas. It probably will be 5. We don't know where they'll be yet, but of course we'll publish where those are. So if it is in your area, if you have services in that area, then as part of our evidence gathering, we will want to hear from providers, and part of the piloting will be about what are the best mechanisms for doing that. We've had conversations with the trade associations previously about their role, but also like actually on the ground, how can we best make sure we're gathering the feedback of providers across both the areas, really. I mean, that's true also of the integrated care system work, which will follow later. That's start of next year when we'll start piloting that. But yeah, we'll want to know, against the same quality statements, although it's a subset for local authority assessment, but certainly that integrated working, we'll want to know what is your experience and how can we play that into our assessments, whether it's local authority accountability or wider ICS. I think there's also an angle here which is about the multidisciplinary teams that we are moving into in CQC, so that we're much better able to join ourselves up across an area. So with those virtual wards or enhanced healthcare in care homes, we'll be better able to pick that up and act on that. We've been quite siloed in the past. I think that always happens with large organizations, especially with such a broad remit. We're so focused on our individual sectors, things have fallen through the gaps, and that is one of the reasons why we are restructuring and rethinking how we do our work, is so that if we're hearing concerns about the local dentist through the care home regulation, or how the local trust is delivering its responsibilities, then we're just better able to respond to that. So again, what I would hope to see is that providers see how that feedback has been taken on board and has driven improvements and driven assessments elsewhere in the system.
Yes, the holy grail, joining it all up.
Yes, it's quite a few holy grails, but we'll get there. We'll get there.
Well, and I mean, you know, we're very enthusiastic about providing a provider voice. And as we often say, you know, it's not just about advocating as providers and our experience of the commissioning arrangements and the partnership arrangements. It's also, many of our members feel they have a very strong advocacy role for the people that they're supporting and their families. So I guess we kind of they wear two hats really in that, in how they can share those experiences, good and bad. I mean, good and bad, in the new world.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take us back to the question that people put in the chat really early on about the all the headlines this week about Ofsted and pressures, and there have been a few comments about the huge sense of pressure that managers feel when it's a difficult inspection environment, and that just understanding the context of the enormous pressure and responsibility that people have, and it's brought into focus in an inspection arrangement. And obviously, if that inspection finding isn't positive, like it was in the Ofsted example, it can have pretty serious consequences. I guess it's thinking about that wider impact, isn't it, of what you're taking a view, but you're not taking a view in isolation, because everything is happening in the context of the wider pressures that we've got. And obviously, there's been a lot of criticism of Ofsted, and there's been a call for their work to stop for a bit while they look at whether or not it's being done well, whether it's being done fairly, whether it's achieving the aim that actually the inspection process is all about, isn't it? The regulatory process. So there's a few people asking that question, and I just interested in, Tim, have you got any reflections before I ask Dave if the CQC have had any reflections?
I certainly do, and we've been contacted during the course of the week by a number of clients that we've supported in the past. Quite emotional calls in relation to what they've been reading about in the press, and to try and sort of condense them into sort of a generic example. People who have dedicated their lives to building care services, providing high quality care, people who would say that they were absolutely the epitome of what good care looks like, and who would absolutely wear that as a badge of pride, and it's something that they are immensely proud in terms of their integrity and their compassion in relation to the people that they support. And they describe the process of being rated out of the blue, requires improvement or inadequate, as being sort of one of the most crushing experiences of their life. And certainly one of those clients saying, I read the story in relation to Ruth Perry, and that could have been me. And asking whether we had thought about offering counselling services alongside legal services to support people through that process. Now, I know that that's something that CMM are looking at, so there is a wellbeing section in relation to their website, and they are looking at counselling services. But I think it is a hugely important issue, because certainly we feel it when we speak to people who've just received their draft report or been told what the rating is going to be, that this is something that goes beyond just a mechanical report in relation to the issues in their service. It is something that really sort of cuts at the heart of how they see themselves. And I think there are a number of really important points, some of which, Liz, you've already touched upon. One is really thinking about what's important in terms of the inspection process and the rating process. So often we see really damning reports which seem to be based upon documentary issues where people have not come to harm, where people will talk about actually the quality of the care in the most glowing terms. And it does seem to me that there needs to be a much greater distinction between, okay, there is something that needs to happen in relation to your paperwork so that you can prove that you're delivering high quality care, and really emphasizing still in those circumstances that people are delivering services which actually you would want for your loved one. And the second point, I think, is that point, Liz, that you've made, which is around making sure that where criticisms are being made in relation to a service, they are put into context. So almost every single negative inspection report we have seen during the course of the last 2 years relates fundamentally to staffing or funding. but rarely will you ever see a comment within those reports putting it in the context that that is a national problem and that funding is the responsibility of local authorities and national government. And that's why I say I'm looking forward to the CQC's extension of inspection powers to local authorities, because hopefully that will shine a light on commissioning practices. But equally, I think those who are on the wrong end of a negative report would feel more comfortable if there was an acknowledgement within that report that many of the challenges that they're facing and the ultimate cause of some of the problems identified was actually to do with local authority and national government policy.
Okay, so I don't know, Dave, if you're able to offer any reflections, if anyone's been talking about it at the CQC, if there's anything you can say, really.
Yeah, we, as you'd expect, we are thinking this through and actively looking at this at the moment. Really shocking case. One thing that's come up is a reflection. I think it might have been through an interview on Good Morning Britain, or a colleague of mine saw it. A reflection that the lengthy narrative report that Ofsted produce it is not helpful. It's not helpful. It doesn't illuminate what the issues are in a clear way. So that's kind of given us some confidence that we're on the right track with having a more structured, a more clear, transparent reporting mechanism. I mentioned earlier that a big part of our strategy is how do we accelerate improvement. That's not going to be something we're going to do between now and October. That's a strategic piece of work that we need to really think about. What are the skills and behaviours we need? How do we do this job in the best possible way, such that it does genuinely foster improvement in every case? How do we do that in conjunction with our partners? And how do we influence how our partners work to mobilise improvement? Part of that is through the local authority and the ICS route, of course, but we need to think that through in the round. To Tim's point on the processes, something I should have mentioned earlier when I was just kind of trotting through the model. What we do at the moment is quite wasteful in terms of you register with CQC. For some service types, particularly domiciliary care, where you're not necessarily providing care to anyone, all will have to go on is paperwork. Then when we come to do a rating assessment, we're looking at the same paperwork again. Nothing's changed with that. There's no material benefit to anybody to look at those policies and procedures. So our approach in the future will be much more joined up, so that we are focusing on the important things. We are focusing on the things that have changed since that registration assessment. And then I think the point about context is really interesting. Now, of course, we talk about that at length in our publications, our state of care report, and so on. But how we articulate that in inspection reports is something that I'd like to take away and think about, because on the one hand, we almost have to be blind. The fundamental standards set out the minimum that people should expect. And so within that report and within that assessment, we have to make a judgment as to is quality here, is the care here of sufficient quality, and is it safe? And we can't take a kind of a relativist view. It is that there are some absolutes there, but this is the real world at the same time. So I think it's a good challenge. Is it enough to talk about it in our national reports, and to do through the influencing work that we do, trying to influence national policy through our wider work through that reporting? Is there more we can do to reflect the local context, and for people whose only contact with CQC might be reading that one report? I think that's a good challenge that we need to think through.
Oh, I'm delighted that you think that. Hooray! I mean, I do think, yeah, I know we're at time. I'm only 1 minute over, but I think that would be very helpful, Dave, if you could think about that context angle, because it does matter. And there is quite good data out there about how to present that context. And, you know, actually, it could form part of the data that the government would like us to help with in terms of provider data on social care. So I think there'd be an appetite to help if we can. and to support more widely. Right, okay, we're at 13:32. I just want to say a massive thank you to Dave for coming along and taking the time to help us understand a bit more about the new landscape. Massive thanks to Tim, our regulatory lawyer. You must always have one with you. It's clearly what I've learned over the years working with Tim. And of course to Lisa for hosting us, and to our sponsors, and to you, lovely lot, who came along and listened and engaged and put some really great questions into the Q&A. So thank you so much. Lisa, are you going to tell us what happens next?
I will do. Just a huge thank you to you as well, Liz, for steering the ship. There's a lot of information there. There's a lot to take in, and I'm sure this will be something we need to revisit maybe later in the year when it's all kind of working in practice and see how it's all going. So perhaps we can plan something in for the autumn and revisit it all together then. But yeah, the session will be, as we said earlier, it has been recorded, so we are going to upload that to our website. So if you want to revisit anything, you can come back and look at it. There were a few questions that we didn't get to. There were a lot of questions throughout the session, so we will speak ourselves to Dave, if that's okay, Dave, and hopefully pull something together, perhaps in the form of a blog or something similar, and pop that up on the CMM website as well. So yeah, thank you all so much. Thank you for your time. It's been a really great session. Thank you. And we will come back to this later in the year, I'm sure. Have a lovely rest of the day, and hope to see lots of you soon on the next sessions that we're doing later in the year.
Okay, thanks everybody. Take care.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.